Hi, I'm Bill Kristol. Welcome to Conversations. I'm very glad to be joined today by two old friends, colleagues, and many, some losing enterprises, some successful ones, right? Spence Abraham, a senator from Michigan for one term, a cabinet secretary, energy secretary for the first term of the George W. Bush administration. We worked together in the White House in the first Bush administration. And Vin Weber, congressman from Minnesota for 12 years.
12 years, right.
Member of the House leadership, leader of the party intellectually and politically for both before you were a congressman and certainly since and here in Washington. Both of you active, I think, as sort of strategists as well as elected officials, staffers before you were elected officials.
That's right.
And those of us who are staffers think it's the staffers who really know everything, not the elected officials. So let's talk. And both you're the two people I call up when I want to know what's going to happen to the Republican Party and to the country. So why don't we tell everyone? So where do we go? We're talking here in mid-late October of 2017, almost a month into the Trump presidency. Steve Bannon's announced a civil war in the GOP for 2018. There's already been some mini skirmishes, a certain amount of chaos. Maybe we'll come back and talk about Congress, but let's just talk about the Republican Party. On the one hand, never stronger, presidency, Congress, governorships. On the other hand, kind of a mess. Which is it, and what happens?
Well, I think I'm afraid that I agreed that it's kind of a mess. We are stronger than we've ever been, quantitatively. If you look at the number of office holders, particularly at the lower levels, that's all really true. And we do quite well governing at the state levels. But I think in terms of national identity, it's harder to identify what the Republican Party stands for today than really at any time in my lifetime. And that inability to define a Republican message, I think, is what's causing so many of the problems we've got. We have competing factions that think the Republican Party should stand for very different things, and it's producing a lot of chaos. Steve Bannon is likely, in my view, to succeed at least in recruiting a whole lot of candidates, and has the advantage of being able to define them as the Trump candidates, even if the president himself doesn't have anything to do with it. They're defining these challengers as this is the real Trump Republican. I think that's a prescription for a lot of conflict in the Republican Party about what our real direction is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing to have the party controls the White House and controls Congress. You're used to fights in the out party. What do we do? We've lost 3 elections in a row. We need to redefine ourselves. But you control the White House and the Congress, and then suddenly you're going to have a bunch of serious challenges, it looks like, to incumbents and real fights in this winnable Senate seats and in House seats. What do you think?
Well, I think it's a combination of both, chaos on the one hand and frankly, a continuation of the party's history on the other. I mean, if you went back over 20, 30 years, I mean, there's always been in the House, a sort of an insurgent group, if you would, that kind of took on the establishment leadership of the House. It was involved in one, although not trying to be as confrontational as I think some are today. And then, we had the young guns coming up and so on. And typically once the group that has been the insurgent becomes the leadership, they become tagged as establishment, and somebody else comes along. And so in that sense, it's very similar. And the same in the Senate. I mean, there's always been, the Republicans have never had a huge majority in the Senate, going all the way back to Reagan's 1980 win. They've had a 2 to 5 seat majority. And there's always been a small group of moderate Republicans or maverick Republicans who have frequently made the majority leader's life a very difficult one because they were not willing to follow, the leader and follow the majority of the caucus. So in that sense, there's a lot of similarity. I think where there is a difference, as you alluded to, is the idea that there's going to be an active effort to take on traditional conservative Republicans who are in elected office and knock them off in states where they're probably very reflective of the Republican Party in their states. And I think this is happening for a lot of reasons, but at the top of the list is the fact that the Republicans have not utilized their majority to fulfill the commitments they've been running on in the last several elections. I mean, I think if the Congress, if the Republican majorities had passed a health care reform bill, whatever they called it, skinny bill, federalism bill, whatever it was, if they'd done these things, and if they do these things, in the case of tax reform, I think a lot of this goes away. But if you don't capitalize on your majority, people will say that you either won under false pretenses or ineffectual, and that's kind of where they are today.
It's one of the interesting things about that, and I agree with what Spence just said. Let's back the clock up to the Trump campaign and the things that we were all saying about the Trump candidacy, the issues that were really dividing or changing the nature of the Republican Party. It wasn't repeal and replace Obamacare or tax reform.
Everyone was.
We're all for all of those things. It was his views on trade, maybe his views on immigration. Some people would have said his views on race and things like that. Those are not the issues that are being brought to the fore now. It's the things that Spence talked about, which presumably we as Republicans largely agree on.
Right.
Well, how much of it is really the failure of the Republican Congress, and how much is that an excuse for a kind of inchoate insurgency that just wants to drain the swamp, burn Washington down, and so forth?
I think that it's it's a lack of comfort with being in charge, and I think that maybe there's problems between them and the White House that have exacerbated it. But I think that a lot of these members of Congress, particularly in the House, have never served in a scenario in which the Republicans actually controlled the White House, Senate, and House. So they came into Congress when they could afford to be, against the Obama administration.
Right.
They could be, vote for anything. They didn't hold ultimate responsibility.
But they
for
knew
things.
the Democratic Senate with Harry Reid for the
Right.
first 4 years. There was a Republican majority after 2010.
Yeah,
would
there was
stop
always
things.
a fail-safe that they didn't have to take ownership of the results. And I would put it to some degree, they're embarrassed by their own brand at this point, because the brand they ran on was a brand that was going to make reforms in these areas where the public is with them. And I don't know what they're really afraid of. I mean, I don't think they're going to suffer at the polls at all if they take these actions. But they behave like the electorate is the electorate of Washington's inner circles and the establishment media, and I think that's cowed them. It's caused them to not take action they need to do, and I think if they do, they'll be rewarded, and if they don't, they'll be challenged.
So, I mean, I guess I would differ slightly in the sense that, I mean, they had a health care bill that they did for whatever reason, its intrinsic limitations, the difficulty of repealing entitlements, the fact that no one made the case for it, that's kind of important in my view, was like 2-1 underwater in public opinion polls. It's pretty hard to ask members of Congress to vote for, I mean, whatever. You all voted for legislation that wasn't wildly popular, but it's usually like 40-60, not 25-70 or whatever the health care bill is. And I personally think the tax bill could end up looking like that. So I don't know. I mean, there's a real disconnect somewhere.
But that's a failure of public relations. I mean, that's a failure of strategy. But it's I don't know how you can run on something for 4 election cycles and then find a way not to.
So you think
pass
that really is key? I mean, the failure. You think
to me, it's
failure. No, it sounds right. I mean,
Yeah.
the failure to pass and repeal and replace. I mean, that could well be. But I'm struck how much I get that question when I'm out there giving speeches. And how could they not do something to repeal and replace Obamacare? It was at the core of the Republican message for 6 years. Part of me thinks that's not really what's going on here, because most people aren't really directly affected by that. It's the individual insurance markets, blah, blah, blah. But maybe it really is key.
Well, I'm saying,
I don't know.
mean, the premise here was, will this sort of new insurgency, be credible and be successful? And I think it won't be if they do something. But if they fail, I think they're inviting disaster, and it'll stoke the fires.
So you think there's something there?
Remember,
probably tax
remember
reform,
when you
passing
go
a tax reform.
back to the beginning of the Tea Party. It was Obamacare that galvanized so many Americans who probably hadn't thought of themselves as Republicans, but embraced Republican Party and embraced its candidates and put them back in the majority. And I don't think those are voters who get up in the morning and think of themselves so much as Republicans. They think of themselves as having interests that they want Congress and Washington to address. And if these guys don't do it, then they'll, move on.
But the only way I differ with that at all, Spence, is I think that most Republicans from the Tea Party day on till this last election were primarily defined by being against Obama.
That's a good point.
Yeah, we were against Obamacare. Yeah, we finally said, okay, we're going to have to replace it, right? But the main thing is they were against Obama. And really, even throughout the entire 2016 campaign, there wasn't a time when Republicans largely thought we're going to win and we're going to change all sorts of things until Election Day.
Yeah, right.
And then with this huge surprise, and even people who were skeptical of President Trump, Republicans, said, my gosh, we've won all three centers of power. We're going to be able to do all sorts of things. And there was a euphoria, I think, in the wake of the election that has led to a terrible hangover now. Because people right after the election really thought there was going to be big change made. They weren't quite sure what it would be. Certainly repeal and replace was part of it. Certainly tax reform was part of it. But there was this huge expectation. We'd elected this very outsider, anti-establishment president. He had a majority of his party in both houses of Congress. Big change is going to come. And now here we are almost a year later, and nothing has really changed in a big way, with the exception of some regulatory stuff that you have to say the president's actually done.
I think they've done good things there.
In the real world, that's probably helped the economy. And
Right.
So it sounds like from what you're both saying, though, that you think, just looking ahead now, and sort of what could happen that will create a dynamic one way or the other, that whether they succeed or not on tax reform becomes a big inflection point, right? The world looks different, Spence, I think what you're saying, in February of 2017, if they've passed something that looks like a reasonable Republican conservative tax proposal of the kind they've talked about for quite a while, or if they haven't succeeded in passing it. Is that?
Well, I'm saying in general, if they're perceived to be actually, passing the things they ran on and moving the agenda forward, I think that they will be, the insurgencies will not be very successful. But if they appear to be incapable of doing that and have no one but themselves to blame at the end of the day, then I think that they're going to be very vulnerable, and people are going to say, let's get Republicans into the Senate or even into the House in some cases, who aren't going to be ineffectual. I mean, I think it's going to...
So you think it's more dependent on that than on Trump or other things? I mean, this is not a Trump phenomenon. It's a frustration with Congress phenomenon more.
Yeah, well, I mean, the relative approval ratings of Congress to Trump are pretty clear. And so Congress is about an all-time low, and they've got to, I think, work to try to enhance it. And a very low congressional approval rating led to their majorities. And so they're going to lose those majorities, I think, if they fail to change that equation.
It's almost a psychological issue as much as it is anything else. I mean, right now, I would be pessimistic about the next election because it seems to me like Trump has really invigorated the left. They're mobilized, they're angry, they're ready to go out and vote, they're ready to knock on doors, they're ready to do all those things that. And that, by the way, that's fairly typical of the out party in a midterm election. But President Trump seems to have inspired it to new heights, and the Republicans are demoralized. They may be angry at incumbent Republicans in various states, but the basic fact that I see when I talk to my Republican friends is they're kind of down about things. We haven't done anything. If we start passing things, I don't view the tax reform issue as being something that will be inherently so popular that it'll get us a lot of votes. I do think it changes the psychological profile of the Republican Party and kind of remoralizes our people and gives us a chance to get back on the field.
And it does something else, which is I think it allows the economy to continue to be strong going into the election. And if it fails, I think you could see some significant economic decline, which would translate into even worse news at the polls.
And significantly, it allows us to talk about the economy. Normally, we would say, for whatever advantages the Democrats have in this midterm election, one advantage we should have as Republicans is a strong economy. But we've been talking about other things up to now, and if we get on an issue, tax reform being the issue, that allows us to talk about the economy a lot, it's sort of shifting the ground to our playing field.
I think so.
And I suppose whether you're a sort of anti-Trump or queasy about Trump or pro-Trump Republican or reluctant Trump supporter, the economy is the easiest thing to come together on. At least Republicans are in charge, and there's regulatory relief, and there's some kind of tax cut, tax reform, and this shows why you need Republican governance, right? I mean, you don't have to. In a way, it allows you to avoid making pro-Trump, anti-Trump the centerpiece of your primary campaign, I suppose, or the general election for that matter.
Well, presidents always get credit for a good economy and blame for a bad economy, and sometimes it's due and sometimes it's not. But, you have to say this president has talked about the economy a lot. He's talked about creating jobs a lot. He's done a lot of things on the regulatory side that are very consistent with what Republicans believe in. And if he gets a tax reform bill, he's got every right to say this strong economy is my doing.
Yep. It is. Though on the other hand, you could say if you came down from ours as a political scientist and said, president gets elected, 46% of the vote. They win. They hold the Senate, lose only 2 seats, lose 6 in the House, less than expected in terms of losses. Economy grows 2-3% for the next 9 months. Stock market up 20%. Where should their ratings be? It is kind of amazing that Trump's only at 40-41, and that's probably a Trump phenomenon. But especially the Republican Congress is so unpopular. It's not as if we have riots in the streets and a depression. I mean,
but I think
in '82 there really was a big recession that hurt the Republican Congress.
But I do think the Congress. I mean, I have a high regard for Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, but I do think that the failure to translate an electoral win has hurt them. And I especially think the health care has hurt, mainly because it has been the centerpiece of most of the last 4 Republican campaigns. And these guys running for the House and Senate have said that's what they were going to do. And so I do think it is, as Vin alluded to, I mean, I think in terms of the Republican base, that's demoralized a lot of the voters.
I agree with that.
Gave these guys
So very short term, I mean, this is actually an interesting tactical question. Can they afford to sort of patch up Obamacare and say, "Oh, that was a tough one, we couldn't get 50 votes, and we're just going to revisit it after November 2018? Or would you counsel them, if Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan called you in, that you do need to take another run somehow at some form of repeal and replace in 2018? I mean, just as a political question, I'm not leaving aside the substance of Obamacare. I mean, can they run on tax reform in a decent economy, or is the Obamacare thing such a
Well, I think they're going to have to at this point, because they're not going to get 60 votes for some health care bill, and I think continuing to lose by ever bigger gaps is not going to.
So that's sort of done. The Obamacare failure is a burden they carry.
It's well, hard. and as we could have anticipated, Republicans in the polls show Republicans now do own the health care issue. So it's a dilemma for us. The president every now and then talks about allowing it to simply collapse. Why? There's every reason to believe that any collapse of Obamacare, further collapse of Obamacare, can be blamed on us.
Absolutely will be. I don't think there's any.
So they should just patch it up and make it through.
There's no
frankly.
shelter in saying this was Obamacare. We couldn't get all the Republicans to vote for it, and it's not our fault.
Right.
I mean, they will own this issue. Vin is exactly right, which is why doing something was so pivotal. And failing to do it will not be able to be attributed to something that happened in 2009 or 10.
No.
So electoral prospects, both for incumbents, I think what you're saying, in the primaries, and I suppose for the Republicans in the general, would be determined to some degree by A, a decent tax reform bill, B, I suppose some other victories on a bunch of issues to show especially Republican-inclined voters that things are happening in the direction they want, regulatory relief, judges, justices, other things, and C,
and a strong economy.
And then just sort of patch up Obamacare and say we'll get to that in 2019.
I think that's the best scenario. Patch up Obamacare, get it off the table. Don't let it collapse because you'll get the blame for it. But you don't want to make it the centerpiece of the campaign.
No.
We want a strong economy and hopefully a strong approach to national security to be the centerpieces of our campaign next year.
Now, do you agree with Spence? I'm not sure I do quite that the Bannonite challenges dissipate somewhat with sort of success in Congress, or is it just more sentiment out there that genuinely just wants change? I mean,
I'm not sure. I have a lot of respect for Spence's political judgment. So when he said that, I thought, well, maybe he's right. But my sense is that there's a movement out there that is not going to be satisfied, and they're going to be. They thought. Part of what they like about Donald Trump is precisely the fact that he did take on the establishment and win, and other people who will do exactly that, regardless of the issues involved, are going to find a following.
So I guess, practically speaking, what happens? We have I
would just say, Alabama will be
so that's in December.
Very insightful, I think, or provide a lot of insight into where this is going. I mean, if that is a close win or a loss, it changes the dynamic, I think, in the way other people are going to view
in the sense that it would seem that, let's call them just Bannonite challengers, would lose a fair number of establishment Republicans in a general election, and it would send the message that starting to depose a lot of incumbents is risky in the general.
I think if the belief is that a Democrat could win Alabama against a candidate who runs to the right of some of these incumbent Republicans who have been certainly mainstream conservatives, that probably changes their calculus. A lot of whom are people that probably don't want to lose. I mean, they're not in it just to carry a banner. The kind of people that they're trying to recruit seem to me to be individuals who, are intending to win. And if they think that calculus changes, that may change who's running.
There's a limited number of states where they're likely to change the general election outcome from one party to another. Arizona is possibly one, maybe Nevada, but as you pointed out, we don't have a big margin.
No.
And we're expecting.
And if Alabama were to be lost,
that would suggest
then
Tennessee.
I think it suggests some of these others could be. It's
Or
not
pickups won't be achieved in the Indianas and Missouris,
That's right.
with certain kinds with more and more candidates, to oversimplify, as opposed to more conventional, I suppose, would be the argument.
That would be sort of a replay of what we saw in previous Senate elections, the last few cycles where we nominated candidates in Delaware and Missouri and elsewhere that just couldn't win the general election.
Exactly.
I suppose one question is, how much of it is psychological as opposed to based on concrete failure to pass A, B, or C, because the people they're challenging are not Susan Collins, who presumably isn't going to be challenged much in Maine, or Lisa Murkowski and John McCain, who are not up for re-election. And so those are the three who stopped Obamacare.
None of them are up.
Right. So Susan's not up either. She was thinking of running for governor, right?
Yeah.
But the people they're challenging will be people who have, I think,
supported
almost
the Trump
literally 100% voting records for Trump.
Right.
Not 80% or 90%.
Well,
has
been
John
several
Barrasso
names-
voted against any Trump nominee? Or
there's several names.
So is there going to be a challenge, Wyoming, against Barrasso? So normally, if you're a political scientist, you come down and look at things and say, well, what's the challenge against Barrasso? He's voted in the old days, moderate Republicans who were actually pro-choice or anti-defense buildup, or I don't know, whatever on some issues. They got challenged by people who differed with them on some important issue.
Right.
What's the difference here? So what is going on?
I have to. Then I think that's really important, and Barrasso is a good example. There isn't a more conservative senator than John Barrasso. He supported everything Trump.
But he's in leadership.
So you have to wonder if this challenge is really about health care and tax reform and things like that. Or is it about that agenda that we thought divided the party over the Trump candidacy in the first place? Is this about electing protectionist Republicans, anti-immigration Republicans, Republicans who will vote to build the wall and make that a priority? Is that really what we're talking about here with some of these challenges?
Yeah, well, I think there's a difference between the people recruiting challengers and the voters. The voters aren't necessarily pushing the same agenda as the recruiters.
Right.
And that's where the distinction, I'd say, is. If there's tangible, positive Republican congressional action,
subside, you think?
I think Republican primary voters will be happy. I think if there isn't, there's going to be a lot of receptivity to candidates who say, if you want to change the way the Senate is, we need more people who are like me and fewer people who are like, the status quo. And that calculus is what's going to ultimately decide the outcomes. And status quo doesn't win if status quo is failing miserably in the eyes of Republican primary voters.
So watch what happens on tax reform. Watch what happens in general in Congress.
Watch what happens in Alabama.
Watch what happens in Alabama. Virginia, the governorship race there with Gillespie, for me, the canary in the mine, this is one of the few things I've gotten right in the last 2 or 3 years. I started saying after Stewart got within, a point or two of Gillespie in the Virginia gubernatorial primary, that, geez, if Gillespie almost wins the Senate seat in 2014. Corey Stewart wasn't he fired from the Trump campaign in October of 2016 for being sort of too far out there? He goes to the point of beating Gillespie. There's a lot of sentiment out there that's and this, I guess, would be my sort of question I would raise about. They'll find some issue. Was Confederate monuments like a real issue? But I don't know. It became one, and that's what Stewart ran. I don't know. Must beat Gillespie, and so that's when I really thought, geez, there's such dissatisfaction with the establishment out there. It's kind of free-floating, and it'll find something to be dissatisfied. And John Barrasso will have done something. He won't have denounced some football player from Wyoming who took a knee. You know what I mean? And that'll become like the big issue in the Wyoming primary, right?
Something like that, yeah.
So that's an interesting thing to look for too, I suppose, is sort of how much these cultural
I think there's a difference
issues,
though between a situation where you have no incumbent with who hasn't worked a state and presumably done a lot of things. I think. I can't comment on how that primary, was waged. It might have been perhaps the case that the assumption was they'd win, and they didn't want to waste resources to pound the
Right.
opponent into the ground, and maybe that was a miscalculation. I don't know. You probably want your money and your resources in the general, but we'll see.
What about
You know,
the
one
two
of the
states?
fir-
Well, go ahead, and then
one-
let's
one
talk
of-
about
one of-
Minnesota and
I'm
Michigan for a
gonna-
minute.
One of the first things I learned when I first got into politics, before I was even a candidate myself, was from our friend Dick Wirthlin, who was one of the giants of public opinion polling, and he was Ronald Reagan's pollster, and he polled for Rudy Boschwitz, whose campaign I ran in 1978. And he did something called semantic differentials. And he says, Spence Abraham, good guy, bad guy, smart, dumb, nice, mean. And you had to define for yourself. He said the most salient semantic differential that he found in that election was one of us, one of them. And I said, well, what does that mean? He said, doesn't matter. The voters figure it out. Here we had Rudy Boschwitz, Jewish, born in Europe, raised in New York, versus Wendell Anderson, Minnesota, a hockey star, and Rudy won the one of us versus one of them hands down.
This is a Republican.
In the
primary.
Republican, in the general election.
General.
So excuse me for going on too long
No,
about
that's
that.
good, that's
when
okay.
when I think about what's going on in these primaries, I think about this one of us, one of them differentiation, and it's not. I think it's less that you're wrong on this issue or something like that. It's you do something that says you're one of them, whatever one of them means. That's a powerful negative dynamic.
I mean, you keep a finger in Michigan politics. You were
Yeah.
senator there. It's your seat that's up, I guess, with Debbie Stabenow running for a fourth term already. No, that can't
Yeah.
be. Jeez. And a state that Trump barely carried, so some chance for a pickup. Tough incumbent, but still. So what's happening? I mean, what do you see there? Do you see a normal Republican primary with a normal nominee, so to speak, or do you
Well,
see?
I mean, nobody knows what Kid Rock is going to do,
Right.
and he has, of course, titillated the Michigan political community and a lot of his fans by hinting that he might run. If he doesn't run, then I think you'll have a very typical kind of Republican primary with people that fit the normal candidate. I mean, maybe in one way they're going to be different because two of the candidates are African Americans, but they're conservative Republicans. But if Rock gets in, then he obviously takes it into a different dimension.
And do you think the celebrity stuff, speaking of that though, in general, I mean, is Trump a bit of a harbinger of celebrity candidacies across the board, or is that just a one-off and,
Well, my own view is that you're going to that celebrities are going to increasingly get into political campaigns. In the old days when somebody's star faded, they went on Hollywood Squares. Now, they think about running for office, and so you get. Vin should talk to this because they've got one in Minnesota. But there's Kid Rock and these others being talked about. I would not be stunned if in 10 to 12 years, 15 to 20% of the Senate is made up of celebrity candidates who run on their fame and on their sort of, their sanctimonious sort of adherence to different platforms. I think we're moving in that direction. I don't know if it'll be further than that, but I think in a decade you'll see more of them, not less.
And also because if we know clearly what they were, athletes, rock singers, reality TV stars, that also tells us we know what they weren't, which is part of the political establishment.
Right. And your state is twice.
Yeah.
what's the second? Ventura?
Ventura, yeah.
Yeah.
And Kid Rock in Michigan could be, the next one.
So that'll be something to watch for, I suppose.
Yeah.
So 2018 in general, and then we'll come to the Democrats. I mean, for the Republicans, they make it, whoever gets nominated gets nominated. Normal political science suggests a rough year if you've controlled the president. If you win the presidency and control Congress, expectations are always too high, and there's always some letdown, and you lose seats like Reagan did in '82, or when
every conventional measurement, all the conventional pieces of conventional wisdom that we have all learned, say the Republicans should have a really bad year next year. The midterm, I guess 30 seats is the usual loss for the party in power in a midterm election. That would be disastrous, of course. The generic ballot test, we used to say the Republicans could win if the Democrat advantage in the generic ballot test was 3 points or less. It's now 14 points. What we don't know is how much has the politics of our country fundamentally turned inside out so that none of these conventional measurements matter. And maybe the turnout of the Trump voters will exceed normal proportions for the party of the president in the off year. We just don't know. But what we know about politics says we're facing a very tough Republican year if it's like it's been in the past.
Right. I think you made a good point, and it's the polls and the are getting less accurate in terms of being able to actually answer the question of who's going to vote and what do those voters really think. I mean, I find it surprising, just to use again the Virginia governor's race, that you could have two polls within 24 hours of each other, one that has Gillespie ahead
Right.
by 1 and the other that has Northam ahead by 14. I mean, it just
And
doesn't.
both respectable pollsters.
And the idea that that's the kind of polling you're getting indicates that the accuracy and validity of these polls is either shifting, in remarkably quick time frames,
Right.
or is no longer very dependable. Vin's right about the historic trends. As everybody knows, the Republicans have the advantage in 2018 in terms of the Senate because so many more Democratic seats are up, and frankly, some of those Democrats have become very vulnerable because of their own mistakes in office. Whether they can be exploited remains to be seen, but there are some winnable opportunities there. The House, on the other hand, typically goes more in a wave, and
Right.
the historic wave that Vin alluded to, I think we managed to avoid it in 1992 or 90 and 92. We didn't lose quite as many seats, but it's usually those kind of margins as Obama found, not just once but twice.
Yeah, no, it's...
The other dynamic, though, that we have to talk about is when we get to talking about the Democrats.
Well, let's talk about them. Okay, so let's talk about the Democrats.
Well, yes, as we said, conventional measurements say we should lose a lot of seats in the House. But if you look at what's happening in the Democratic Party around the country, it gets a little less attention because there's not a Steve Bannon figure out there, and maybe Bernie Sanders. But the Democrats are moving very much to the left. And the candidates that are coming forward to challenge our allegedly vulnerable Republicans are going to be much more like Bernie Sanders than they are like even Barack Obama, who was pretty much a liberal Democrat. That's what's happening at the local level in the Democratic Party, wherever I look.
Yeah, I'll talk more about that because I'd say a lot of Republicans say that. You don't know if it's wishful thinking sometimes. Or Democrats are in as bad shape as the Republicans. The Civil War is just less visible. Of course, with all those incumbents, it's less obvious because they're not mostly getting challenged in primaries. So it looks united, but that can be misleading because beneath the surface and in open seats, you could imagine bitter primaries and things going on at the local level. I just don't know it. It's hard to tell from Washington probably what's really happening on the local level.
Well, I think Vin's point is well taken. And it's not just sort of the imagery of these candidates. It's what the National Democratic Party's unifying themes are, which are so, much embedded into the identity politics side of the equation that I think it could very much work to the Republicans' advantage. I mean, the Democrats, are sort of like that team that used to play the Harlem Globetrotters. They march, the Washington Generals. They march out every game, and they make the same mistakes, except the Washington Generals actually knew when they threw the bucket of water, there was confetti in it. The Democrats don't seem to know that. So so they keep repeating these mistakes. And I find it hard to figure out what kind of strategic thinking is going on there because they're embracing issues that I don't think will make much of an impact on their base in terms of any greater turnout, but which are clearly alienating to the exact blocks of voters they've been losing, and it seems to me that could be the the ultimate differentiator in the election. And why they keep doing it, why they want to march down this road, may have to do with it's the only thing they all can agree on. But it's definitely going to injure the candidates.
Is it cultural left or economic left? Do you think
it's
going?
Cultural left, and that they're advocating. I mean, it's the
so it's the identity politics.
Yeah, I mean, and plus they've got they've embraced and messengers who are exactly the wrong messengers for the electorate that they're losing. I mean, the electorate that they have in Michigan and probably in Minnesota are the same. The working class white voters. Historically the Democrats understood that they could play the politics of envy with these folks. And so they would talk about millionaires and this and that and so on. Who are the Democrats embracing as their chief allies and spokesmen? Millionaires from Hollywood, millionaires from sports, celebrities who live a lifestyle that is completely alien to these people. And on top of that, they have these millionaires preaching to these working class Americans and acting as if these people are brainless and politically incorrect. I think they continue that. It's a prescription for Republican success.
You see that in Minnesota? I mean, what's happening?
Yeah, what I watched over the last several months, the nominating process in Minneapolis, city of Minneapolis, because they have city elections there. And city of Minneapolis is as reliably left-wing Democrat a city as you've got in this country. There's not a single Republican elected official in the entire city. And the Democratic officials, most of us would describe, I think, universally as liberal Democrats. Nonetheless, raging battles for city council positions, for the mayor's office. And the phrase that I saw was, well, so-and-so may be a liberal, but she's not an ultra-progressive. That word was used. And you can just see that coming forward. The Bernie Sanders folks are, and I don't mean to put this all on Sanders, but that's where this movement came from. The Bernie Sanders folks think they would have won the election if he'd been nominated, and they think that the failure to embrace what they, at least in Minneapolis, called ultra-progressive views is why we have Donald Trump as president.
Losing a winnable election at the presidential level especially is a great recipe for a party telling itself, if only they'd gone the way I wanted them to go, we would have won. I mean,
sometimes it works out okay. It helped Reagan get elected in 1980.
But you get to say both, let's be true to our principles, and we could win. Yeah, it's not clear that Reagan would have won in '76, right? But
no, I don't.
But don't you think if you were there then, it helped Reagan? I mean,
it helped Reagan immeasurably for the next
Ford
4
had
years.
Lost by
everybody
margin.
said if we nominated Reagan, we wouldn't have had Carter as president. I don't know that that's true. In '76, Watergate was still the dominant issue. Carter might have beat Reagan even more badly than he did Gerald Ford.
And Reagan of '76 wasn't Reagan of '80 and blah, blah, blah.
But for 4 years, everybody who was for Reagan said he would have won. And it helped him immeasurably to get nominated.
Which is why you frequently have people who don't make it the first time and fail in these nominations processes, get the bid the next time, whereas the losing nominee is typically over. Nixon being the only real.
You want to lose a close race to someone who loses the presidency.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Reagan would be the example. But, the current example of that is Sanders. Well, let's jump ahead to 20. Let's talk Democrats. I was shocked. I was in New York and saw a Democrat, a Bill Clinton Democrat, admittedly, so not a little biased. And I said, it's probably going to be Trump, from my point of view, very bad scenario. Trump versus Elizabeth Warren, or is there room then for an independent candidacy in the middle? Because I don't really want that choice personally, He said, why do you think it'll be Elizabeth Warren? And I said, well, I think the left has the momentum. He said, no, you misunderstand me. Why won't it just be Bernie Sanders? I mean, you're being too establishment to think that they'll default to sort of a slightly more respectable, actually, type and a slightly younger type than Elizabeth Warren. He got 45% of the vote. Are any of those people going to desert Sanders? No evidence of that. Doesn't he pick up some voters who just went to Hillary because it was her turn or she was a woman or something? I mean, I don't know. What do you think the dynamics in the Democratic Party are?
First of all, remember
I guess it depends what
by
happens in
2020, it'll be 16 years since the Democratic Party nominated a white male for president. And I think, given the electorate that votes in Democratic primaries, that the odds favor a non-white male nominee again, and maybe will increasingly favor that in the Democratic primary because of the focus on identity politics. And because there's going to be, I think one of the things that came out of 2016 is we could have elected a woman, we just didn't run the right woman. So I think there'll be a lot of pressure in these primaries to nominate, an electable Democratic woman, and that will give a Warren or a Gillibrand or somebody else some support.
Or an African American.
Yeah, right. But I think the Democratic Party's primary voters are moving them more in the direction of nominating a diversity candidate versus Bernie Sanders or any of the white male candidates that had been their historic, of course, a pattern. And so I don't know that that's the case. I think that could be a big factor just when you look at the demographics of their primary voters.
And they are riled up and anti-Trump, and I suppose there's not going to be any penalty for being more anti-Trump and more extreme in your denunciation of Trump and even the Republicans in general than the next guy, right, or next person. I mean,
one of the interesting dynamics we want to watch play out in the next several months, really, and then into the next year is in these Democratic nominating contests. How much does impeaching the president become a litmus test issue? Because you see the leadership in this town, the Democratic leadership. They don't want to start impeaching the president.
They want a conventional,
right? Exactly.
2-year midterm where they,
But the activist base, the people like I mentioned that want ultra progressive nominees, impeachment's very much on their agenda, and you could see a situation very easily where an awful lot of Democratic nominating contests come down to who's more for impeachment. And then those things have a way of kind of spreading, and eventually the people that are already in office say, well, gosh, I don't want to get on the wrong side of the impeachment people, and pretty soon you've got a whole movement for impeachment. I think that's bad for the Democrats, but it's also not good for the country.
No.
I guess a lot depends on Mueller's report. Obviously, that's a huge wild card that will affect 2018. I mean, Mueller's report by itself could turn 2018 into an impeachment election, obviously, if he refers, like Ken Starr, to the Hill of possible impeachable offenses. If he doesn't, I guess the Democrats could still run on impeachment and just denounce Mueller as a,
Well, we've
Bush FBI
we've
guy.
got
What do you
people
think?
that are calling for impeachment now,
Yeah.
and they don't have any real crime that they're pointing to. It's a political issue. And as Speaker Boehner said when he was asked about this several months ago, he said an impeachable offense is anything that a majority of the House of Representatives says is an impeachable offense. Now, I agree with you, Bill. It's hard to do this in the absence of something a little more legalistic than that. But the reality is, impeachment is a political process.
I mean, I do wonder in California, there's a challenger who's stepped up against Dianne Feinstein. It's one of those things everyone in Washington, I had this instinct too, oh, come on. I mean, she's been there forever. She's popular. She's a competent senator. I mean, they'll be fine. There'll be a challenger. He'll get it. I mean, it's still different because they don't have a party primary.
Right.
Leaving that detail aside, he'll get his 35% and protest vote. That always happens. But maybe I'm just, this is a case where we'll look up 3 months from now and he's going around the state screaming about impeachment and she's being a responsible ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and we have to see and the facts. And she's let some Trump judges go through because she can't stop every judicial nominee, even if she personally might vote against them. And suddenly he's getting traction. That's not impossible.
It's not impossible at all.
No, I mean, and if it wasn't a state where even if she doesn't win the primary, she's in the general, and the Republicans have to vote for either her or the ultra
Liberal,
left-wing
so that helps
candidate,
her,
she
yeah.
probably wins. But if it was not that system, I don't think she's safe in terms of the majority of Democrats. I think that in that state, there's probably a lot of sentiment that would go against her just because of some of the stances she's taken that are perfectly responsible ones, but which have been treated with a lot of fanfare because they seem to be a breach with the current conventional Democrat shrill attacks on Trump or on Republicans.
I mean, you could argue if you wanted to cheer up your one's Republican friends a bit, that the Democrats in a way could have the worst of both worlds, which is pretty extreme rhetoric, out of touch with, as you said, sort of the working class voters who went to Trump with their concerns, looking culturally, Hollywoodish and so forth on the one hand, and sort of very same old, and literally old leadership on the other. I was a little struck in Georgia 6 in that primary that the Republicans hung on to win by 5-6 points. They won. They won. It should be bigger, but still they won after a huge amount of $30 million
for Tom Price's seat.
Yeah, $30 million in the Democrats' Atlanta suburbs. And I saw a little bit of polling afterwards that had been done for one of the committees that was working, Super PAC, working in the race. Nancy Pelosi was the single most effective argument for Karen Handel, for the Republican candidate. I mean, they went after Ostroff a little bit. He didn't live in the district. He was 30 years old. He wasn't probably an ideal Democratic candidate for that kind of seat. But they just said, he's a rubber stamp vote for Nancy Pelosi. And if you're a swing voter there, really, that's what the Democratic Party's alternative is? And I wonder how much that hurts them. As I say, it's sort of both like back to, 2006 on the one hand and too radical on the other. And I don't know, that would be maybe the Republican silver lining going into 2018.
It's amazing that Nancy Pelosi has remained a negative symbol as long as she has. You see this every now and then. The Republicans ran against Tip O'Neill for an election, maybe 2 elections, but and Newt was an issue for an election, maybe two elections. The Republicans have been running against Nancy Pelosi for 10 years, 12 years, more than that.
And she's hung on to leadership
for a long,
too,
that's
which
right.
is
That's right.
in one way
the
impressive,
Democratic,
in another way welcomed by Republicans.
And you guys are Michigan and Minnesota, and the Democratic leadership is from Chuck Schumer from New York, not from Manhattan, from Brooklyn, as he would be quick to correct me, from New York City, and Nancy Pelosi from San Francisco, from the Bay Area. Their most recent presidential candidate, obviously, a senator from New York, defeated a northeastern senator, Bernie Sanders, the most prominent senator, probably Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. I think if you're a Michigan or Minnesota working class swing voter. That doesn't look like your.
No.
Right, back to Vin's earlier is,
one of us.
one of us, one of them.
Yeah.
And if you look at the Democrats who remain in the House, almost all, an overwhelming percentage are either from New York, or Massachusetts, Illinois, or California, or from majority-minority districts. And beyond that, I think the Democrats have less than 100 House members. And
considerably less, I think, if you
if you take those, maybe it's 70 or so. And as a result, in places like Michigan and Minnesota, I think that is exactly the perception that isn't the kind of people that appeal to those voters.
Let's step back from 2018 and just try to look at the moment. I mean, I guess one way to put the question is, on the one hand, you could say it's kind of business as usual. At the end of the day, narrow Republican Senate margin, as you said earlier. That's happened many times in recent history. Republican House margin, presidency turned over after 8 years. There were some legislative struggles. But, it's kind of might have some setbacks in 2018, but kind of it's recognizably. It's the American politics we all operated in for the last 20, 30 years. And then sometimes I think, at least, everything. It's conceivable this is a huge inflection point. Everything's changed. You have a president who's extremely unusual in the way he views the office and handles the office. Media is totally different. Conservatism seems to be in question in a way that it hasn't been, I think, since we all came to Washington. So where are you on this is sort of mostly still the same system with the same parties and the same operation and the same, of course, media changes, but not fundamental, or we're really at some inflection point into, uncharted waters, whatever cliche or metaphor you want?
Well, I come down more in the uncharted waters side of that equation, but for several reasons. One is that I do think that from this point forward, the world has to evaluate politics, politicians, and so on through the lens of the social media communications world that we live in.
You think that's really a fundamental change?
I think it's a big difference, and I think Trump's victory proves it's a big difference. And I think to evaluate it otherwise, and evaluate him otherwise, would be like after the 1960 election, still evaluating the presidency with the kind of criteria of the pre-television ways that presidents were evaluated or were judged or were even covered. I mean, it's just changed that, and Trump can't be looked at in the conventional terms that we've always looked at presidents. He now has to be looked at from the point of view that he has the ability to communicate with a support group that's very large, that doesn't care about what traditional or establishment mainstream communications and media say about him. I mean, they have their own ways to interact with him. I think that's going to be the norm, and so I think it is uncharted because we don't know how that process will work. The other thing that I think is clear is this: it's not just here.
Yeah.
If it was only Trump, I think you could. I'd feel more like this is an aberrational perhaps outcome, but it's what happened in France. It's what just happened, in Austria. I mean, it's happening in a lot of different parts of the world where voters are just looking at people running for office and at government and its role and so on differently. And
it's not consistent ideologically.
No.
You look at Austria and France, both are examples of the established order being upset to the far right in Austria and to the left in France. It's not as if the world is moving ideologically, at least in terms of how we think about ideology, in one direction or another. But there certainly is turmoil that has to mean something. Another piece of it that I look at, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'd like to come back to it. We've got a strong economy, booming stock market, declining unemployment, actually wages starting to go up, and over 60% of the people say the country's on the wrong track.
Yeah.
We don't get that. The three of us, and most other people, because we are so used to thinking that people's perceptions of the direction of the country are largely connected to their own economic fortunes, and that seems to not be the case. So there's something else going on that is causing people to be unhappy, disconcerted, and as Spence pointed out, it's if it were just America, we could explain it in one way, but it's across the entire Western world.
So globalization, technology, communications, a zillion things. Some of it real, some of it having real economic
but
effects.
I think there's a cultural coarsening that's a part of it too, and I'm sure we all agree that those are factors as well, and some of them, are really beginning to have bite with the, average working person in America and elsewhere.
I mean, I get frustrated by this and just want to say, look, things aren't that bad. The politics of American politics for the last 70 years is not a failure. It's complicated, but it's not a failure. We've had real failures. We had American politics that led to a civil war. After all, we had a Great Depression. We didn't cause it anyway, World War II, but we stayed out of things in a way that allowed that to get out of control. We haven't done any of those. We haven't had a Great Depression. We haven't had World War II. We haven't had a civil war. So compared to the preceding 70-year chunks, why don't we get some credit for that? But that's not the mood of the voters. I mean, that is striking how unhappy they are and how willing to reach for what some of us might call demagogic solutions, and others would say are daring solutions, or just unorthodox policies.
And some of those just awareness of all the bad news. There is a difference in that sense. I mean, we've always said if it bleeds, it leads. That coverage of government politics, the country, and so on is generally, from the standpoint of what's wrong. But now, I think through the social media, this is intensified and reinforced, and it's pretty hard to get a positive message, with much traction.
It's also hard to divine what change the country really wants. You think about it, it's not as if we haven't done anything over the last 20 years. The biggest thing being the passage of Obamacare, hugely unpopular, cost the Democrats the Congress, maybe cost them the presidency. Smaller things, but back in the Bush administration, No Child Left Behind was a significant change in educational policy, became hugely unpopular. I mean, it's hard to say what change people really will applaud, because I'm not sure that the general discontent translates into a very specific agenda. I do think that we tend in Washington and government to say it's all economic because we think we know what the economic levers are. We think we can, if you're a liberal, well, we'll change the minimum wage and we'll redistribute income a little more through the tax code and we'll pass some jobs programs. If you're a Republican, you say we're going to cut taxes and we're going to reduce regulations because we know what economic levers are. But I'm not convinced at all that what's going on in the country and the rest of the world is larger or is as much economic as we want to say it is. It's because it's much harder for us to figure out how are we going to deal with these discontents if they're cultural and psychological and related to the communication system and not primarily related to economics.
Right. Well, and I think people sense there's such rapid change in the things that affect their lives. And a lot more predicted. I mean, when people, who are just average voters, read the stories of what's coming, whether it's in science and technology or it's driverless cars or it's all kinds of things, new, developments that are happening. I think it creates unease, and I think unease can, often translate into dissatisfaction. And as Vin said, I think the very good point about the fact that it's not one thing. It's, you've got probably half of both political parties or more who are unhappy, but they're unhappy for exactly the opposite reasons. One, because the country's hasn't moved far enough to the left, and the other because they believe it's moved too far to the left. So.
And in that respect, the uncharted waters is sort of a good metaphor, I think, because it does imply the challenges can come from any direction, and you could veer off in any direction.
Yeah,
one could imagine.
You could think you're going to discover India and end up discovering North America. Right.
And one can imagine Trump making this up. He does something in North Korea or something, would provoke something, and then there's more of a conflict or whatever. And you can imagine the reaction being very hawkish, I would say, and tough guy. Thank God we have a tough president finally, standing up. Or you can imagine totally the opposite reaction. What are we doing in some conflict 10,000 miles away and risking ourselves and stuff? Okay. And it could be the same people who are sort of torn back and forth. Like we've seen that in the reactions to Bush and to Obama. People and Trump himself perfectly epitomised. I'm staying out of those stupid wars. Right. I'm a super tough guy, but we need to also rip up the Iran deal because because I'm a tough guy, really, and that was a bad deal because Obama did it. But it's a little incoherent. I mean, if he wants to stay out of conflicts, he probably should leave the Iran deal alone. I'm not for ripping it up, but I mean, which does make it very hard to predict these things, right? I mean, what will the world look like? What will the economy look like in 2019? What weird event happens? That's what I'm a little spooked by, too. I mean, a huge Ebola. A Democrat said this to me. This was partly a Democratic apologetic kind of thing, so I don't quite buy it. And she said to me, the Ebola thing hurt us more in 2014 than people realized. It was like this weird disease. It looked like it was out of control. It looked like the government was slow. Afterwards, probably either handled adequately or handled very well, for all I know. I don't know enough about it. I mean, maybe it'll be studied as a success story in the public health schools. We do not have Ebola, plagues here in the U.S. and really not around the world. But things can become such, or that oil spill in '09 or whatever.
Right.
These things become Katrina. These things become so huge for a week, a month, 3 months, and probably do really affect voters. I think Katrina really did hurt Bush. Though in retrospect, you sort of think, look, I'm not to defend what he did if I did some things wrong, but I mean, I don't know, is that a real, or Trump with the hurricanes? I mean, are we now going to have our presidential politics is defined by how you handle natural disasters, and not to minimize that you should have a competent FEMA and people shouldn't, suffer and so forth. But I don't want to sound like, horribly insensitive person. But it's a strange way to define success or failure of presidencies. It's not the way we're used to doing it.
Some of it goes back to I suppose, the nature of the media that we've talked about just a little bit. In the past, if you had a Katrina-type experience, you'd tune on the evening news at 6:30 and you'd see, gosh, that's a horrible, terrible thing. Now it's 24/7 on all cable news stations.
And within 3 days, people
else.
are judged horrible response or, surprisingly good response, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly. And now everybody's, the immediate question is this another Katrina? So now it's microscopic evaluations of, whether or not it is. And in Texas it isn't, but in Puerto Rico, because the local mayor there says it's terrible, it becomes, a different perspective. So, but at the end of the day, I think we are and back to your original point here is I do think we're a little bit on the uncharted waters area now, and not just in the U.S. but somewhat global basis.
I mean, Trump is the first president who neither had served in elective office, nor had kicked the cabinet, nor had been a general officer in the U.S. Army. And it could be fluke. He was 16 Ranfield. He's a particularly skillful demagogue and politician of a certain kind.
Well, it could be his opponents' help, too.
Could be his opponents. But it also could be a moment where people look back and say, well, we had one system, so to speak, which elected governors and senators and Dwight Eisenhower, and now we have a system that elects. That's in it, for me, and I think people still underestimate the possibility that it is a break, it is an inflection point, and there are going to be other Trumps, and I don't mean this in any judgmental way or even that they'll be like Trump, but just sort of others who are very unorthodox.
I think that's very possible.
I think it is.
What about the parties? Doesn't that suggest that we're so comfortable with the two parties and the way they've shaped up? And could that really change? I mean, how solid is there?
You have four parties, so.
Yes.
So I think
funny we were both about to say the same
thing. Okay, so go. You guys explain.
I'll happily defer to Vin on this,
you go first.
But no, I think you've got within each party essentially two very distinct parties, and one, whatever you want to call it, the mainstream or the establishment party within the Democrat and Republican sides.
Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side and Mitch McConnell on the Republican.
Or whatever. And then you have people who are more radical in each party, and I think you're leaning towards the obvious question, which is there some way that the two middles end up together, and that, to me, until this moment, I don't think there was a likelihood America would see an independent party or a third party emerge. I think now you could have because I do think that there's a lot of, I don't know how large that group would be,
right?
Because it might be very hard to get people together, even though they share much more than they do with the other people in their party in terms of common viewpoints. But I do think you could see that kind of development. I think if ever it was going to happen, now is a prime likely time for it.
I very much agree with that. Notwithstanding the fact that we know there are institutional barriers to a third party in this country, but they're not insurmountable. We've had third party candidacies that have made progress in the past, and I do think that the very, for us, to your last point, Smith. Yeah, you're right. The establishment Democrats and the establishment Republicans have a whole lot that they don't agree on. But we've been talking about politics in the course of this discussion in ways that indicates this laundry list of issues on which we agree and disagree is not maybe the most important thing. And the very fact that there would be a party other than the Republicans or the Democrats, I think would be hugely attractive to a lot of people who would put it in kind of this anti-establishment mode. Just like we don't like the establishment politicians, we certainly don't like the two establishment parties. So, I'm not predicting it necessarily, but I very much agree with Spence. The moment is there for something to come together.
And I would just add, I don't think it could be led by these people who are currently in the establishments of either party.
Well, that's the
It
question.
has to be someone who offers an almost anti-establishment alternative, but it appeals, to a large block of mainstream people who don't want to see the country move in a radical direction.
I mean, Trump, in a way, of course, I was discussing this last week because I want to say, well, Trump is the third party, and there's some truth to that too, which makes it more confusing and cross-cutting. But
yeah, and as he continues, evaluating him on the current amount, 9 months or whatever as president, is too soon. In this respect, I think you have to see after 2 or 3 years whether or not there's a cohesion within the Republican ranks, and he's moderated perhaps, or the party's pulled together. But I don't think that's the same thing that we're alluding to here. I think you do see, at the basic level, some emergence.
and would this be? Is a 2020 presidential independent candidacy the way this happens, or does it happen at first at the state level? It seems to me a lot of people want to say, well, of course this would happen first somewhere in the 50 states, but I'm not so sure that's true. Do you think? It seems to me in a weird way the parties are there's less dissatisfaction at the state level, right? In a way,
I think we're talking about a national phenomenon. There are certain states, my state of Minnesota being one, that every now and then experiment with third parties. Maine being another one, but by and large, we're talking about a national phenomenon. If there's an opportunity for this or the possibility of it, it's at the very top.
I suppose it would be. I'm just thinking about a moderately failing Trump presidency that doesn't fail so much as to deny him the renomination if he wants it,
Sure.
and a Democratic Party going left. Right. That's sort of the perfect scenario for the Macron, the independent. But that's the independent centrist candidate who has to both appeal to establishment-oriented voters without looking like the same old establishment. It's a little tricky there.
There has to be a person,
Yes.
and there has to be, I think, probably a strong issue or rationale.
Right.
I don't think it can.
It can't just be I'm a good guy.
I'm in the
I'm a
middle.
responsible
Vote
business
for,
leader.
Vote for somebody who's moderate on everything.
So it's not Dwight Eisenhower in the second.
But
so to
I'm
speak.
going to come back to a point I made before. You can't be the establishment candidate if you're not a Republican or a Democrat. The very fact that somebody would emerge
So
as
you can have an establishment background, but if you say
Yes.
I'm against the party,
if you're running outside the two-party system, it defines you as not the establishment candidate. It may not be enough to get you elected,
That's
but
interesting.
it's in and of itself, it's an important statement.
And I suppose the one way you square that circle is you don't have a radical agenda in terms of cutting off trade or populist issues. You have a sort of political reform political reform agenda. There's something nuts about our Congress. They can't produce a new budget every year. There's something nuts about the polarization, which doesn't allow people to work across. You can imagine that kind of. You could be a reformist and a centrist somehow without just being a split the difference centrist. I guess that would be the.
Yeah, it's hard to say today what it absolutely would have to be, but I think Vin put it right, and that it can't be somebody who just was the last time around was running for the Republican nomination as a conventional Republican or Democrat. It's not going to be Martin O'Malley. It's not going to be
John Kasich.
Yeah, John Kasich. I don't think.
Do you think it's a 40-year-old fresh face, or is it a 65-year-old experienced guy who's not a partisan or who's transcending partisanship?
I think it could be go anyway. It could be any of the above. Yeah. And I wouldn't, by the way, I don't know about John Kasich, but Kasich is doing quite a job of identifying himself as an independent political actor. I generally agree with what Spence said. It can't just be somebody that ran last time and lost. But in Kasich's case, he's taking steps to identify himself really as quite independent from certainly the Trump administration and ultimately probably from the Republican Party.
Yeah,
I think, I'm not giving John Kasich advice here, but I would think he has to decide, don't you think, in early 2019, whether he's a Republican challenger to Trump or an independent candidate. I don't think you can do both. You can't, like, I'm going to take a shot on the Republican side, and if that fails, I'll move over to be an independent. That's John Anderson, right? That doesn't work. Perot, to his credit, had a coherent message, partly because he never toyed with either party, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And then he had a I think you also need, I think, a distinctive issue. I mean, Perot had the deficit.
It's much more likely to
trade.
happen if there is
Trade, yeah.
And I have a hard time seeing it being somebody who has been, is sort of like they got beat as a Republican, so now they're running as an independent. Maybe it could work, but I think it's
more likely somebody outside of politics.
Right. Yes, I think you're right.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And I suppose this turmoil in uncharted waters, does it carry over within the parties to the degree that we haven't had a successful challenge to a sitting president within his party since, I guess, LBJ, you could argue, was driven out of the race in effect by the McCarthy and Kennedy challenges, though it's not clear that Johnson might not have won renomination in practice if he had tried. But we have such a long history of defeating the primary challengers, whether it's Reagan or Kennedy or Buchanan or and then the last couple, there haven't been any, right? The last two presidents, have stopped them. He lost three: Clinton in '96, Bush in '04, and Obama in '12. Deflected any possible primary challenge. Okay. So I don't know. It's low odds of a successful challenge to Trump.
Donald. As of today, Donald Trump owns the Republican Party. He may get a challenger because there's enough discontent and restlessness and things like that. But nobody's, at least in my view, nobody today is going to beat Donald Trump for the Republican nomination. Nobody's going to come close.
On the Democratic side, I suppose there isn't the kind of front runner. There isn't the Hillary Clinton, George W. Bush phenomenon of the semi-prohibitive front runner.
Well, if there is, it's Sanders. But I'm not sure that he'll get that nomination for a lot of reasons. But I go back to what I said a few minutes ago. I do think the composition of the Democratic electorate favors a diversity candidate over, even a liberal white male in the long term. And
I suspect people are underestimating. I guess I said this before. The possible radicalness of the Democratic Party by 2020.
Yeah.
And for all that they say they know, but single payer could be the least of it, honestly. I mean, by the time we get
I think Ben hit, with the impeachment issue, there'll be something that is like Iraq was in 2008 that becomes the measuring stick that'll knock a lot of these would-be candidates, and there are a lot of those.
I'll come back to my own little world of Minneapolis politics. Yeah. There are candidates running for office in Minneapolis that have said they can imagine a city without police. And this has now become an issue, as you can well imagine. But you never know how far
they'll go. There in Minneapolis.
Right. It's not the majority view, but my point is, when politics starts moving substantially in one direction, you never know how far it's going to go. You never know how it's going to break out.
And which issue will be the catalyst of what, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's not necessarily a big issue, sometimes a symbolic one act of police violence. I mean, whatever, that Trump reacts to it a certain way, and suddenly, I was thinking of the justices. If Trump gets a couple more nominations, and the Republicans hold the Senate and they get them through, I wonder if the Democrats will go. How far could they go in sort of trying to do what Republicans have occasionally talked about in the past, stripping the Supreme Court of jurisdiction, really challenging it. They don't want to be constrained by a Supreme Court for the next 10, 20 years that Trump McConnell unjustly held a seat open for, and then Trump,
it's an illegitimate Supreme Court.
Right. And you could imagine that.
Now,
what policy they would propose exactly, I don't know, but they could end up being in the business of much more fundamental of constitutional reform or challenges to the status quo than we sort of see right now, I suspect, and the Republicans too, depending on how they split. Okay, well, I don't know if that's good or bad. That's a little worrisome, but I'm sort of excited by, enchanted or tantalized by the independent candidacy question. What's the biggest? I mean, the biggest obstacle is, I guess, just right person in the right place, right? I mean,
and I think they also, to do it, if somebody wanted to do it, I believe they've got to go and recruit 50 House candidates. And 10 Senate candidates or some number to run with them. In France it was a two-step process, but I still think I think to get elected as an independent and then try to govern would be a mistake. I mean, it may happen. I mean, I could see it happening, but I think the likelier outcome is one where, a whole group of similarly inclined people say, we're going to go to Washington, we're going to run 10 Senate candidates or 15 this time, and a whole slate next time, and we're going to run 50 House this time and 150 next time, and we're going to put people in positions to actually change law, not just to have a president, but to have control of the Congress and a new direction. I think that is the preferred way to go, because I think otherwise you'll have nothing but gridlock and chaos as somebody gets elected with no support, in either party, or no, at least deep loyalty.
There still are some obstacles to independent presidential candidacy. Our friend Peter Ackerman has made the argument that the National Commission on Presidential Debates basically helps to preserve the presidential duopoly between the Republicans and the Democrats. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think if an independent candidate cannot make the argument credibly that they're going to be on that stage for the presidential debates, it discredits them to a substantial degree. On the other hand, there are some obstacles that don't exist as much as they did in the past. We've seen Trump and Bernie Sanders have shown you can raise money through the internet in ways that was never possible before. You used to have that party structure in the past to raise the kind of money you needed. That's not necessarily as true anymore. So there are some obstacles, and there are some obstacles that have fallen.
Right. And the social media has changed.
Yes,
the ability
absolutely.
to communicate without reliance on the National Press Corps, I think, is the main ingredient that allows that to happen. If Ross Perot could have had access to the sort of social media capabilities we have today, who knows how well he could have done.
And I suppose that if it doesn't happen in 2020, you could imagine the Democrats winning in 2020 and then a huge Republican sort of circular firing squad and a real split into the two Republican parties, like into 2022 and 2024. I mean, that would be the shakeup. One always tends to focus on the next election, but you could have a two-step kind of process where you end up shattering the current system.
Very, very possible.
Congress, let's just take a few minutes. You both served there. One does have the sense that it's just dysfunctional from a kind of common sense point of view. Like, they can't pass legislation and budgets. I mean, otherwise it's a great governing body.
I think there's
what
two
about it?
phenomena that are happening. One, which is stunning to me, and I'm sure probably to Vin, is that there was a long period, and it sort of came in the wake of Watergate, where Congress sought to shrink the executive branch and expand its own power and muscles and so on. And now you almost see the reverse happening. You actually, seems to me, see Congress that would prefer to have presidents use executive orders to do things so they don't have to. And I'm really surprised that Congress is willing to relinquish to the executive that kind of muscle and power. And then I think the other thing that's happened in the Senate certainly is, and in the House, I guess, more in the Senate, I think, is the sort of process by which we now have only a limited number of bills that are going to go through, and so everything is tied up in those bills. Everybody else's bill is thrown in if they've got support and so on, and as a result, there's not much legislating. When I was in the Senate, it wasn't that long ago. People put a bill on the floor, and we worked on it for a couple of weeks, and a lot of amendments were offered, and then a bill passed, usually pretty on a pretty bipartisan basis. You don't see this anymore. And so now there's just an elite small number of people in leadership and leadership staff who are negotiating these key pieces of legislation. And the rest of the Senate is sitting around with a lot of time in its hands, which is how you get celebrity candidates to run for the Senate and how you get so many senators who now think they should be president. And I don't think that's...
And you get resignations from people who might once have thought, hey, I'm a committee chairman in the House, I could really make a difference, and now it's like...
I guess it's not a huge number, but if you think about the number of people over the last several cycles that have actually resigned in the middle of their term, not for health reasons, that you never saw that in the past. People, and it's not lots and lots of people, but every now and then you see one, and I think that wouldn't have happened in the past.
Yeah, it just does seem to me that I mean, it's not very sexy, I suppose, to talk about congressional reform, but there's something just crazy about the current. There's both too much centralization, it seems to me, of power in a way in leadership, but it's not real. It's not real power. They can't actually make, when the crunch comes, they can't necessarily deliver the votes. But somehow, meanwhile, nothing happens. The relevant committees don't work on legislation. Everything gets held up for the one big, tax bill or the one big end of the year CR, omnibus, debt ceiling bill or something. I mean, it is kind of.
And I think the mentality that says, if we don't do anything, there's executive orders, will cede to the president powers that, were
Right.
traditionally, the legislative branch's authority. And
That's exactly right.
Do you guys think a
willingness to
young
do this.
senator or congressman who got elected and said, I don't want to just be a rubber stamp for leadership, I don't want to be a pointless protester, rubber stamp protester against leadership, so to speak. I'd actually like to do something in this area I care a lot about. I don't know, education or drug policy or one of a million areas, foreign policy. I mean, is there room for that person to say, what about this? I'm going to try to put together legislation on this issue, maybe bipartisan legislation on that. I mean, it seems to me, I talked to some of these younger members, and they have that instinct, but I think they don't quite know, how do I do it in the face of these massive...
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of people that would like to do just what you said. I mean, I think Spence and I probably would agree on this. I defend the institution. Most of the people that get elected run for office because they want to do good things for their country. They are interested in public service. But they get caught up in the politics of the moment, and the politics of today says if a Republican and a Democrat start working together on something, that is a cause for suspicion by their grassroots voters. Doesn't mean it can't happen. Doesn't mean it might not happen. But there's a cautionary note there. People think I'm going to have to go back and do town meetings. Are they going to say why am I as a Democrat working with the Trump people? Or why am I, as I am a Republican, working with Nancy Pelosi's lieutenants? And you think, rather than answer those questions, I'll just not try to get involved in working with people across the other side of the aisle.
Do you think it's the voters, the primary voter?
Well, I think the
constraint is the big,
I think
is
the
a big
electorate,
one.
for all the reasons we've been talking about, social media being probably primary. I think the electorate is very is polarized and contribute to the poll. You can't let the people off the hook entirely here.
No, the
Well,
tribalism
and
goes there,
but also,
right?
it is. There are so many one-party districts now,
Yes.
and certainly one-party states that the primary voters are your electorate.
Yeah.
I mean, if you win that, you're in, and maybe Roy Moore won't be in. I don't know, but if you're in
Right.
most of these districts, the constituency that matters is the constituency in your party that is probably the more extreme side of your party, and as a result, you are suspect. A yellow flag will at least go up if
Exactly.
you're perceived to be too much of an accommodationist, and that's.
I think the one-party state part of that's important because in the old days when there was a Republican and Democratic senator, let's say New York, D'Amato on one hand, of course they were going to work together on at least state-specific things, or you and your Democratic counterpart in Michigan, and which sort of lays the groundwork, though, for other things. It legitimates the notion of it. If you have a ton of states, all the southern states with 2 Republican senators, basically, all the northeastern states, in California and the West Coast with 2 Democratic senators, they don't even have that kind of can we at least work together to get funding for what we need here. And so I do think the voters get less used to. I mean, I remember in New York, and maybe this is a bit of a myth, but there was a certain sense that D'Amato, as people certainly fostered, since it was mostly a Democratic state. It's good to have a senator from each party. Because you know what? You can have a Republican White House, Democratic White House. You want to have good relations. You want to have good relations with the majority leader and the minority leader. New York needs a lot of help in areas A, B, and C. I think ag states had this attitude a little bit. We want a Democrat and a Republican because who knows what deals have to be cut on the Finance Committee or for, on the Agriculture Committee or something like that. And that spirit is not. I mean, that spirit had its own problems. It led to an awful lot of back scratching and deals that maybe weren't in the public interest in a certain way. But that spirit is not there anymore, I think.
Well, and it's funny too. How many people I hear bringing up this issue of the ending of earmarks and that the term limits on committee chairs and so on have, in fact, undermined the ability to get a lot of things done. And so sometimes the cost of good intentions is pretty high.
Yeah. Okay, we'll reform Congress, reform the parties. We'll see what happens in 2018, 2020. I think so. We're all on the uncharted waters side mostly of the situation.
I think we're on the side that this we don't know where this is going. It's uncharted waters, but it's real. It's not imaginary. It's not made up. It's not totally unique to the personality of the President of the United States. It is a different time in our politics.
Let's hope it becomes a better time ultimately in our politics. That's happened in the past, and we've gone through very roller coaster periods and ended up, I think you could argue, as better off as a country. And well, we'll hope so, right? Vince, Spence, thanks so much for coming on. Thank you for joining us in Conversations.